We've been talking about the Enlightenment in America, the shift away from more Puritan values and a Puritan aesthetic in writing and literature to a more expansive and open sense of what literature can be and what thought can be through literature. We took the turn in the last few lectures as we considered the ways that Jonathan Edwards is a bridge figure connecting the Puritans on one hand with the Enlightenment on the other, and Benjamin Franklin also is something of a bridge figure, sort of moving out of the old traditional conservative way of public thinking but moving in a direction that perhaps is outside the mainstream, though always trying to make it a little more palatable to his reading audience. Today we're going to talk more about the big ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideals of the Enlightenment, the aspirations of the Enlightenment, by taking a look at ways that figures writing at that time brought those into existence in the text that they were producing, both from their personal writing perspective all the way up to the Declaration of Independence, announcing to the world as a work of text, a work of literature, a work of rhetoric, that the United States, or the colonies that would become the United States, would be splintering off from England. We're not just going to talk about the ideals of the Enlightenment, though. And in subsequent discussions, we are also going to focus on the limitations of Enlightenment thinking, and to some extent, the harms of Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment was very good for a certain group of people, very bad for other groups of people. And so we'll want to be taking a look at that as well, and not turning our eyes away from the darker, more sinister side of the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment, as the term suggests, is light, is the light of reason, we know that light has the ability to create shadows. So the emergence of light in the Enlightenment is necessarily accompanied by the emergence of shadows, some far darker and more sinister than others. Our discussion of the Enlightenment over the next few sessions is also going to include a look at the neoclassical writing style, how that's different than the Puritan writing style, and what are the characteristics of it. And we're going to take a look at the neoclassical writing style, specifically as it's performed by Phyllis Wheatley, and also Judith Sargent Murray, and Francis Scott Key. And then we'll be shifting, as we bring those discussions to a close, we'll be shifting and starting to explore the emergence of the Romantic sensibility in United States literature. And for the rest of our course, then, we'll really be focusing on literature that has a strong connection to Romanticism, the major literary movement of the 19th century, early part of the 19th century, that includes all of Europe and also the Americas. But to really sort of kick off our discussion of the Enlightenment, I thought what it might be really helpful to do for those who haven't had like an introduction to political science course, or haven't done sort of a history of ideas course, or a philosophy course, or a world history course, would be to simply bring you up to speed on the figure of John Locke and his ideas, and the way that Locke's ideas went on to influence the Enlightenment thinkers, especially here in America. So Locke is a British philosopher, and he's best known as the author of a work called the Second Treatise on Government. I mean, he wrote a lot of important works, but this particular work, I think, has had a huge effect on the history of ideas. Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. And as I mentioned, he's the author of what's called the Second Treatise on Government. Locke is a pivotal figure in the Enlightenment. He comes very early in the Enlightenment, as you can see from his years. If you think about the timeline for the Enlightenment that we've talked about already, and his ideas around what makes a government and what makes a nation, what the purpose of a nation is, played a huge role in the thinking of the Enlightenment figures and revolutionaries in the American colonies as they considered breaking away from England. What is the essential argument that Locke is putting forward in the Second Treatise on Government? Well, Locke says that humans exist in a state of nature, that this is a natural condition for mankind. And there's a sense of liberty that comes along with the state of nature, freedom. It's the ability to do as one best sees fit without interference. That's an intrinsic value for Locke, the sense of liberty. Now, it's not a limitless right. And that's an important thing that Locke recognizes. I think sometimes in our current cultural moment, or the idea of rhetoric, the current cultural rhetoric around concepts of liberty and freedom, there is a sense of liberty or freedom means I get to do whatever I want, but we all can't do everything that we want without the risk that we're going to be interfering on other people. So Locke says, look, liberty is the state of nature for humankind, but it's not an unlimited kind, right? Locke says we have certain natural rights, and our own personal liberty can't butt up against someone else's natural rights. For Locke, because he assumed that people were equal and therefore equally capable of discovering their own full potential, equally capable of bringing themselves into their fullest sense of being, we can't harm other people in the pursuit of our own natural rights in the context of their, and this is going to sound a little familiar to you, right? Their life, their liberty, their health, and their possessions. So these are part of the natural rights that Locke says humans have. And for Locke, these are rights that are given to humankind by God. But, he says, this all sounds good on the surface, right? But the natural condition of humankind is one of instability, right? I say, I have a right to my life, you have a right to your life, or I have a right to my possessions, and you have a right to your possessions. But how do we enforce those rights? How do we actually guarantee that those rights are being protected? In the marginal cases, or the cases where things are a little ambiguous, how do we determine what the proper outcome is going to be? For Locke, this is the role of the government. Locke says that governments are instituted by humans to be responsive to humans. That governments exist to secure the natural rights, to provide needs, and to fulfill the desires of citizens. Therefore, no one in a system of government is going to be capable of having absolute power over everybody else in the system of government. No ruler can truly claim absolute power without infringing on the rights and liberties of other people in the society. People have to be free to pursue their interests, Locke says. They have to be free to be able to make plans and see those plans through. Now, Locke has been criticized, as many Enlightenment thinkers have been, rightly criticized, I would say, for a lack of imagination and as to who falls into this umbrella of life and liberty and health and possessions, right? Look at the time when Locke is living and think about the number of people who say, my possessions include other human beings. Human beings whom I own through the process of slavery. Now, is that a violation of someone's life and liberty? Or would it be a violation of someone's property if a government were to break down that institution? Or when property and liberty come into conflict with each other, how do we adjudicate that issue? Locke also has been rightly criticized for the idea of what is property, what are possessions. Locke says something becomes yours when you mix your labor with nature. So you can take control of land by cultivating that land. Right? And Locke famously argued that he believed the Native Americans were not sufficiently cultivating the lands of America. Therefore, they had no claim to the lands. But someone could come in and try to cultivate it and could, Locke's perspective, rightfully kick people off of lands with very little compensation or very little recourse to challenge that based on their ability to labor and cultivate and organize the land. Governments exist to prevent people from taking more than their fair share, though. Okay? And importantly, Locke argues that if a government is put together for this cause, the cause of protecting life and liberty and property, if a government is assembled for that purpose and the government becomes corrupted to the point where it's not fulfilling those purposes, then humans have a right to engage in the dissolution of that government and the creation of a new government that will adequately protect those rights and liberties. So think here about how similar that sounds, I hope sounds similar to you, how similar that sounds to the overall picture of sort of where America comes from during the Revolutionary period. How influential these ideas are as they're going to trickle down into some of the individuals whose works we're going to consider today, Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur. It's important to understand that idea because I want to make clear that what's happening in the Revolutionary period in the United States, or what will become the United States, what's happening in the Revolutionary period in the American colonies is in a spirit that has already been developed elsewhere, specifically England and Europe. And when we talk a little bit about the neoclassical period as it develops in England, you'll see too echoes of this kind of idea in the revolutionary and the civil wars that were happening in England during the 17th century. Tensions between those who were loyal to the king and those who were loyal to a parliament, who was going to be able to have control. It eventually led to the execution of King Charles I, and then eventually a reinstatement or a restoration of the monarchy in England from his son, Charles II, 11 years after his execution. So this idea, or these key ideas related to Locke's theory about what government exists for, are important and influential. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at where the sort of Lockean spirit of the Enlightenment shows up inside examples of American rhetoric. So I want to start first with Crèvecoeur. Crèvecoeur is a very interesting writer. He's a French writer. He comes over to the American colonies. He lives in the colonies. He tours the colonies. He goes back to Europe at different parts. He's a very self-made man in a sort of Franklinian sense, in the sense that he brings himself and his perspectives alive in writing. Crèvecoeur's main contribution to the world of literature is a book called Letters from an American Farmer, where Crèvecoeur is writing letters back to a fictionalized audience in England that talk about what life in the Americas is like. He's adopting the persona of an American farmer and talking about the American colonies through the lens of this character, in a lot of the same ways that Benjamin Franklin seems to create some sort of character. It's not quite fiction, it's not quite nonfiction, there's a little bit of philosophy, there's a little bit of imagination, it's all sort of being woven together. Crèvecoeur's letter number 3, What is an American, is one of his most famous letters. And I want to think about the way Crèvecoeur uses rhetoric in that letter to help sort of capture these Lockean ideas, but also put his own spin on what it means to be an American at this time. For our own knowledge and just sort of setting things up so that we're all on the same page, it's important to recognize that Crèvecoeur is writing these letters during what we would call the Revolutionary period, sort of circa 1770 to 1780. It's not being published until the 1780s, so this is after the Revolution, when America is in this period of post-1776, but not yet to a constitution, an important and a powerful period for American rhetoric. Crèvecoeur tries to answer the question, what is an American? And on page 554 of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, this is volume A, edition 10, Crèvecoeur says, he has arrived on a new continent, a modern society offers itself to his contemplation, different from what he had hitherto seen. It is not composed, as in Europe, of great lords who possess everything, and of a herd of people who have nothing. Here are no aristocratical families, no courts, no kings, no bishops, no ecclesiastical dominion, no invisible power giving to a few a very visible one, no great manufacturers employing thousands, no great refinements of luxury. The rich and the poor are not so far removed from each other as they are in Europe. He talks about how the people of the country are unified by what he calls the silken bands of mild government, respecting the laws, all respecting the laws, without dreading their power because they are equitable. He says, in the Americas, this is the voice of the American farmer that he's adopted, we have no princes for whom we toil, starve, and bleed. We are the most perfect society now existing in the world. Here man is free as he ought to be, nor is this pleasing equality so transitory as many are. On the next page, 555, he continues. This is about halfway down the page. Everything has tended to regenerate them. Talking here about the people who have come. New laws, a new mode of living, a new social system. Here they are become men. In Europe, they were as so many useless plants, wanting vegetative mold and refreshing showers. They withered and were mowed down by want, hunger, and war. But now, by the power of transplantation, like all other plants, they have taken root and flourished. Formerly, they were not numbered by any civil lists of their country, except in those of the poor. Here, they rank as citizens. By what invisible power has this surprising metamorphosis been performed? By that of laws. and that of their industry. The laws, the indulgent laws, protect them as they arrive, stamping on them the symbol of adoption. He goes on to say, this is the great operation daily performed by our laws. From whence proceed these laws? From our government. Whence the government? It is derived from the original genius and strong desire of the people, ratified and confirmed by the crown. So he's using this imagery of plants, right? Over in Europe, the climate is not good for this plant. So you kind of dig up the plant, you make sure you've got the roots, you take it over somewhere else, you put it down in good soil, and it's going to really take root and it'll grow and flourish as a result of that. It's one of the many interesting metaphors that he uses. He uses it again on page 557, right? Men are like plants. The goodness and flavor of the fruit proceeds from the peculiar soil and exposition in which they grow. We are nothing but what we derive from the air we breathe, the climate we inhabit, the government we obey, the system of religion we profess, and the nature of our employment. So he's making an argument that who the people are, the character of the people, is shaped by the context that they are living in, shaped by the government, shaped by the culture that they are working in. And he's trying to argue that in the American colonies, that culture is one that is shaping a sort of egalitarian, equal, liberty-minded society. And that it's open, he says, to a variety of different people. Not just British colonists, but a variety of people from around the world. And he introduces a metaphor that you probably have heard of before, the idea of the melting pot of America, right? Lots of different people thrown into a pot and everything gets kind of mixed together. On page 556, about halfway down the page, he says, here individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. So he has a sense of positivity associated with what America can be. Okay? I mentioned this as sort of the American ideal. For Crèvecoeur, it's a sense of what America has the potential to be. And we have a lofty rhetoric full of metaphors and comparisons and high stylized language, sort of praising the American idea. That sense of the praising of the idea is sort of wrapped up at the end of the letter in a short paragraph where he kind of brings his idea of what is an American, he's bringing it to a close. On page 563, where this passage is, here's what Crèvecoeur says. After a foreigner from any part of Europe has arrived and become a citizen, let him devoutly listen to the voice of our great parent, which says to him, welcome to my shores, distressed European. Bless the hour in which thou didst see my verdant fields, my fair navigable rivers, and my green mountains. If thou wilt work, I have bread for thee. If thou wilt be honest, sober, and industrious, I have greater rewards to confer on thee, ease and independence. I will give thee fields to feed and clothe thee, a comfortable fireside to sit by, and tell thy children by what means thou hast prospered, and a decent bed to repose on. I shall endow thee beside with the immunities of a free man. If thou wilt carefully educate thy children, teach them gratitude to God and reverence to thy government, the philanthropic government, which has collected here so many men and made them happy. I will also provide for thy progeny, and to every good man this ought to be the most holy, the most powerful, the most earnest wish he can possibly form. as well as the most consolatory prospect when he dies. Go thou and work until thou shalt prosper, provided thou be just, grateful, and industrious. So the language shifts here into almost sort of a stylized, almost reminiscent of like the King James Bible. But even this idea of like, welcome to my shores, distressed European, blessed the hour of thou arrival, almost seems to sort of presage or predate or preview the idea of the poem that would adorn the steps of the Statue of Liberty many years later. A sense of welcome to the shores, give me those who struggle and they can find a home here in America. The poem, not there when the Statue of Liberty is originally put there, but there later added a poem by Emma Lazarus called The New Colossus that she wrote to help raise money to help ornament the base of the Statue of Liberty. I share that with you because we're talking about the ideals of the Enlightenment, right? Aspirations of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers thought that people could be perfected through reason. Not that they were perfect, but that through reason and hard work and diligence and the adoption of the right mindset and senses of equality and liberty and the move away from the sort of very narrow thinking in terms of absolute political authority, absolute religious authority, that you could open the door to a perfectibility of humankind. And when we read a text like Crèvecoeur's Letter from an American Farmer, we would do well to ask ourselves, is this still true? Or moreover, was it ever true? Was it always an ideal? Is it an ideal worth continuing to fight for? And if it is, and striving toward it, if it is, how do we get there? These are big ideas that are introduced, as you can see, from the very start of America as a nation. And we're still having debates and talking about them today. Turn with me to the excerpt that I had you read from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now I ask you to take a look at this brief passage from Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, because I think it's another way in which the ideals of the Enlightenment are sort of held up for the world to see, put on display, drawn attention to. Paine makes the argument that's in favor of the colonies breaking from Britain. And he frames this, as Jefferson will as well, he frames it in the sense of common sense, in terms of logic, in terms of it just makes sense when you sit down and look at it. Page 600, the excerpt starts, "Perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right and raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of custom. But the tumult soon subsides. Time makes more converts than reason." So there's a sense here of Paine understanding he's going to have to use reason, he's going to have to use logic and intellect in order to make his case. But he also recognizes that he might be a little early, that people might not be open to this idea yet. When he says, not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure general favor, to describe his ideas. But he says, stick with me. The more that you think about this, the longer we reflect on these ideas, time is going to make more converts. So this might seem radical, Paine is suggesting, but in time it will not be radical because time will make more converts than reason. The cause of America, Paine writes, continuing on page 601, about halfway down the page, is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Many circumstances have and will arise which are not local but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. The laying a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of all mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth, is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling, of which class, regardless of party censure, is. So, notice the ideals of the Enlightenment, or the philosophy of the Enlightenment captured here, right? This is of interest to all mankind. These are universal ideas. This is not just one group of people, but sort of a group of people taking forward, leading the charge, right? Grabbing the flag and leading the charge on behalf of people everywhere. For Paine, the Enlightenment is the possibility of all people to reach these conclusions. And he sees the American colonists as playing an important role in this. At the start of part 3, Paine writes, "In the following pages I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense, and have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than that he will divest himself of prejudice and prepossession, and suffer his reason and his feelings to determine for themselves that he will put on, or rather he will not be put off, the true character of man, and generously enlarge his views beyond the present day." Paine talks in the text about a new way of thinking. And like Edwards before him and other writers after him, I'm thinking specifically of Wheatley and Key, just an example of those that we'll look at in this course, he laces throughout imagery of light and the sun, right? This is about bringing things out into the light, bringing them into the public for discussion, having these thoughts that previously were not allowed to be talked about due to the cultural environment. It's one of the ways that we can see the Enlightenment as reacting against the Puritan aesthetic, pushing back against it, bringing things out for open discussion. On page 606, we can really hear the way Paine is channeling these ideas that come out of Locke. "A government of our own is our natural right," he says after the break in the page. "And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner, while we have it in our power, than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. If we omit it now, some Massanello may hereafter arise, who, laying hold of popular disquietudes, may collect together the desperate and the discontented, and by assuming to themselves the powers of government, finally sweep away the liberties of the continent like a deluge, like a flood. Should the government of America return again into the hands of Britain, the tottering situation of things will be a temptation for some desperate adventurer to try his fortune. And in such a case, what relief can Britain give? This idea of a natural right, of fighting to secure your own rights, of pushing back on abuses against those rights, is pure Locke. And for the purposes of our course, captured, I think, no better in any other document than the Declaration of Independence. So let's turn to the Declaration of Independence as it appears in your Anthology. This is on page 624, and it comes out of Thomas Jefferson's autobiography. Jefferson, as you probably know, is an aristocratic guy from Virginia. He spent some time overseas in Europe on behalf of the United States government. Later in his career, he's a politician, local politician in Virginia. He's got high potential. He's sent to take part in these discussions of the Continental Congress, and it's going to be a break from Britain. Jefferson is the lead writer on the Declaration of Independence, but there's a committee of 5, which includes John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We've already talked about Franklin. We'll talk about Adams here soon. They're part of a committee of 5 who draft this Declaration of Independence, submit it to the group makes edits, the group adopts it, and we all know on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is adopted and celebrated as Independence Day here in the United States. The version of the Declaration that's in your Anthology comes from the autobiography of Thomas Jefferson, where he prints, not necessarily passive-aggressively, although he really seems to think that his version of the Declaration is the superior one to the one that ends up getting adopted. If you've ever done anything by group work or committee, you know often the final product is not exactly what maybe you as an individual would have preferred. But Jefferson provides us with his original draft of the Declaration of Independence and shows us in the Norton Anthology through underlined text and also text in the margins what was struck out and what was added in. The rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence is admittedly staggering. It's beautiful. It's simple. It's elegant. It's powerful. It's powerful in its simplicity. And it's elegant in its simplicity as well. The Declaration of Independence takes the form of a basic argument, a legal argument, you might say. It opens with a preamble, establishing the general idea. It sets forth its thesis, which is that it's time for the American colonies to break away from Britain because the British government has abused the principles of government, the very principles that Locke argues that a government is supposed to have and adhere to. It then provides evidence in support of that thesis and brings about a conclusion. The thrust or the movement of the Declaration of Independence is a kind of inevitability. Once you get to the end of the document, the effect is that it really should be an inevitable conclusion. That if everything that follows the conclusion is true, it's hard to reach a different conclusion than the importance of breaking away from Britain. Let's see the way Jefferson puts some of these ideas in action and how the text itself really is structured. Ideas that we might want to think about in terms of the rhetoric of the situation. There's not this doesn't have a sermonic quality to it in the same way that some of Franklin's writing does. But there's still something to it in the structure of this that feels like it could be read aloud and delivered almost as some sort of secular sermon. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So Jefferson's saying here in the opening paragraph, look, we're not just going to say, hey, we're breaking away from you, right? It's that if you're going to undertake such a momentous step, you owe the world an explanation. You owe the world the ability of using your reason in an enlightened sense to explain your actions and what you are doing. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Okay? Now, that's one sentence, right? That's a lot of information to cover in one sentence. But the force of the sentence propelling forward is incredibly powerful and essentially provides a very succinct summary of Locke's idea, right? There are natural rights. These are those rights. That government exists to protect these rights. That a government only has the power to do that from the agreement of the people it's representing. That if it becomes destructive, the people have the right to set it aside or to change it and put in a new government that's going to protect those rights. Prudence indeed, Jefferson says, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So it's got to be pretty serious. And the implication here is, well, if we're doing it then, right, we're going to say up front, look, we don't think that this is something that should just happen for any light or frivolous reason. So if we're doing it, we think our cause is incredibly just and the reasons are very, very important. He makes a transition into what he calls the injuries and usurpations of the king, King George III. Now, he lays the blame at King George III as a monarch, right? He's the king who oversees all of the English empire. Okay? But as we look through the list, right, the king doesn't actually do these sorts of things, right? I mean, you can't blame George exclusively for every single thing on this list, but that's kind of the point, right? He's an easy figure to put the blame on because he's the head of state, but also notice too, he has the divine right and total authority of kingship. And if that's the case and the government has become corrupted, then ultimately it's his responsibility. And the idea of a monarch with total authority over everyone else, is antithetical to the Enlightenment idea, right? The divine right of kings, the role of kings, that's an old idea, right? That's the way it used to be. Now we're looking at the way that it can be, changing the world for the better. Jefferson provides this list, catalog of what he says George has done. Every paragraph starting with, he has blank, right? He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly and continually for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people. He has made our judges dependent on his will alone. He has erected a multitude of new offices. He has abdicated government here, withdrawing his government and declaring us out of his allegiance and protection. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Interestingly, the last item in the list is a condemnation of slavery that had to be removed from the Declaration of Independence so that representatives from the southern colonies would sign on to it as a unanimous agreement. He switches now to a challenge of these ideas as under the sense of a kingship, and says on page 628, the final draft of the text reads, "We must therefore hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and peace friends. And we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." There's a powerful Enlightenment style logic to the force here. This is not an appeal to tradition, or an appeal to the power of kings, or to an appeal to God, or to an appeal to moral authority here on earth. This is a sense of, we have rights, these rights are supposed to be protected, you are trampling our rights, therefore we are okay to break apart from you in order to protect these rights. Some people, I think, have rightly pointed out the tensions and paradoxes that exist in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, the text says, and leaves open a question to us. When the members of the Continental Congress say all men are created equal, they mean men, right? They mean X chromosome and a Y chromosome, men in the sense of this. And we know too that their idea, not just of who counts as a man, but who counts as a human, is also under the stress of this high language, right? Thomas Jefferson is writing these words at the exact time that he owns other human beings. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But who is the governed? Who gets to play a role in electing that government? Who gets to serve in that government? The brilliance and the tragedy of the Declaration of Independence, I would argue, is the very language like this. It's brilliant because it sets a goal for us. But it's tragic because even today, we're still trying to reach the ideals put forward in the most expansive understanding of the language in this text, right? I think today we would read, all men are created equal, men here as a stand-in for humankind, right? In the sense that that word mankind doesn't just refer to men, biological men with an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, but in a sense of all humans, right? That's sort of the promise or the potential of the Enlightenment. The sense of being equal, of having liberty, of securing justice. Okay? And the text is gesturing toward that, but yet it's very limited in who it's actually talking about at that moment. So I think we can criticize the text, I think we can praise the text. I think we can point out its shortcomings at the same time that we can praise its potential. How it sets the goal. How it puts the bar where it needs to be. And we have been trying to continue to clear that bar for the entire run of our history. And that sometimes the bar gets cleared, and then sometimes it feels like the bar gets raised a little more. Or a new generation of people are not able to clear the bar as they used to. Jefferson's writing in the Declaration of Independence, along with Paine's writing in Common Sense and Crèvecoeur's writing in Letters from an American Farmer, represent the ideals of the Enlightenment, represent the potential of the Enlightenment. But that's not all there is to the Enlightenment. And in our next discussion, I want to talk about the limitations of the Enlightenment, or where some of the thinking was unable to go, but to recognize that voices at that time were either engaging in hypocrisy on principles of the Enlightenment, or trying to advocate for themselves and being thoroughly ignored.